Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
They say every family has a golden child and a forgotten one, and if that's true, then I spent 32 years mastering the art of being invisible in my own home. My name's Sarah, and from the moment I could understand words, I knew they weren't speaking to me. They were speaking through me, around me, at me, but never to me. My older brother, Derek, sucked up all the light in the room without even trying. Not because he was brilliant or kind or even all that likable, but because my parents decided he needed it more. He was sensitive, according to my mom, and struggling to find himself, even at 38 years old. What they meant was, he never held a steady job, couldn't keep a relationship longer than 3 months, and was still living in the same bedroom he had when he was 15, surrounded by dusty movie posters and unopened Amazon boxes paid for with their money. Meanwhile, I worked part-time at a diner from 16, paid my own way through college, got into marketing, and climbed the ladder with bleeding fingernails and a fake smile. I never asked them for a cent. Never needed to. Not because I had more, but because I was taught by their silence and neglect that needing something from them came with too many strings and not enough love to make it worth it. Now here I was, standing on the edge of something new. I was getting married to Mark, a man who, despite not being loud or flashy, understood me better than anyone ever had. He was the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, who picked up on details I didn't even notice about myself, like how I tapped my foot when I was anxious, or how I tucked my hair behind my ear when I was about to lie. He called it my tell. He was the only person who'd ever called me out, not to hurt me, but to see me. I didn't grow up with that kind of honesty. I grew up with parents who pretended everything was fine as long as Derek wasn't crying. My mom used to say, Derek just needs a little more time, but I remember being 10 and hearing the exact same thing. And then 15. And 22. And 29. By 32, I stopped keeping track. Still, I invited them to the wedding. Call it obligation. Call it stupidity. Call it the last gasping attempt to pretend they might show up for me, for once, and not just because they felt guilty. And they came. Mom, Dad, and Derek. Derek didn't bring a date. Of course not. He brought a hangover and a half-ironed shirt that still had the Goodwill tag on it. He also brought that air of resentment he wore like cologne, strong, suffocating, and designed to make everyone else apologize for existing. The rehearsal dinner was awkward. My dad barely spoke to Mark's parents, except to talk about the tough job market for creatives, a passive-aggressive jab at Derek's lack of income. My mom spent most of her time praising the venue, the flowers, the playlist, everything Mark and I chose together, but only to me, like it was my bridal dollhouse and I should be grateful she was even there. Derek sat at the end of the table, scrolling through his phone like he was waiting for someone better to show up. I didn't say anything, because that's what I was trained to do, keep the peace, smile, and pretend I was fine. But Mark saw it. I could tell by the way his hand tightened around mine under the table. Later that night, back at the Airbnb we'd rented for the weekend, I asked him if he was okay. He said, I'm fine. Just watching the way they treat you. That's all he said. Just that. And yet it hit me harder than any screaming match ever could. The night before the wedding, I went back to the house I grew up in to drop off a box of extra favors. Dumb idea. Should have sent someone else. But I was still doing that thing, trying to earn something that should have been freely given. I let myself in with the old key, walked into the kitchen, and froze. I could hear them talking, Mom and Derek, sitting at the dining room table. Their voices were low, but not that low. She doesn't need the money, Derek, my mom was saying, like she was explaining a weather pattern. Mark's stable. He's in tech. They'll be fine. This is your chance to get caught up on your credit cards, maybe even finally get your own place. Derek sounded annoyed. She's not gonna go for that. It's her wedding. She'll freak out. She won't, my mom said, like she knew me better than I knew myself. She never does. She's always been accommodating. Accommodating. That word hit like a slap. Like I was a hotel room, not a daughter. I'll talk to her, she added. She'll understand. I backed away from the door before they could see me. I stood in the front yard, the box still in my hands, staring at the house that raised me and wondering how I ever thought anything inside those walls was real. The worst part wasn't that they were planning to take the wedding gift money. It wasn't even that they thought they had the right to. It was how casual it was to them. Like it was already decided. Like I didn't matter. I drove back in silence, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. When I got back, Mark was on the couch, laptop open, spreadsheets up. He looked at me once, saw my face, and closed the laptop. "You heard something," he said. Not a question. A statement. I nodded. "They're going to try to take the money. For Derek." He didn't look shocked. He just nodded slowly. "Okay, then we'll take care of it." I looked at him then, really looked. And in his eyes, I saw the thing I'd spent 32 years searching for. Not pity. Not excuses. Just someone who saw what I saw. Someone who didn't think I was overreacting or imagining it. We didn't say anything else that night, but I could feel something shifting. For the first time in my life, I wasn't going to be the doormat. Not this time. Not with him beside me. And yet, a small part of me still held out hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd surprise me. They didn't. The sun hit the stained glass of the chapel in a way that made the entire room glow, a soft orange shimmer washing over the guests like some kind of divine Instagram filter, and for one small second, just one, I almost forgot what kind of people were sitting in the front pew with my last name. It was the kind of wedding that Pinterest dreams of, simple but beautiful, elegant without the pretension, music that didn't sound like it belonged in an elevator, food that didn't taste like regret, and more laughter than I'd heard in months. But even under all that beauty, even beneath the layers of ivory silk and fresh roses and smiling friends who'd flown in from other states just to celebrate with us, there was a knot forming in my gut that I couldn't ignore. My mother had barely looked at me when I walked down the aisle, her face locked in a neutral expression like she was attending a corporate brunch instead of her only daughter's wedding. My dad gave me a stiff half-smile, more like a reflex than any sign of joy, and Derek, God, Derek, he wandered in 40 minutes late, wearing a blazer 2 sizes too big and battered white sneakers like he was going to a fucking barbecue. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look embarrassed. He walked up the aisle in the middle of the ceremony, smirking at some inside joke he'd made with himself, and sat down with a dramatic sigh like we'd inconvenienced him. I kept my eyes locked on Mark, whose hands never left mine, steady and warm and sure, like they always were. That steadiness grounded me while the chaos swirled around the edges of everything. People tell you your wedding day flies by, and they're not wrong. Between the vows and the photos and the cake cutting and the small talk with 100 guests, most of it is a blur, except the parts you wish you could forget. We made it to the reception in one piece, even danced to that dumb 80s song I picked just because I liked how ridiculous Mark looked trying to do the Running Man. But even as I laughed, even as we twirled and people cheered and toasted and clinked glasses, I felt it coming. You ever have a moment where you know something's about to go wrong, but you're not sure where it'll hit? That was me, floating in a perfect day with a storm cloud just outside the frame. I was talking to Mark's cousin Amanda, sweet girl, a bit too into astrology, but harmless, when I saw my mom coming toward me. Her dress was deep plum, her hair in that same stiff updo she always wore to important events, and her eyes were sharp, unreadable. She motioned for me to follow her. I didn't even get to finish my champagne. We stepped outside onto the terrace, away from the music and the laughter and the people who actually gave a shit about me. She didn't start with a compliment. "No, you look beautiful," or "We're proud of you." She went straight for it like she was placing a grocery order. "We're going to take the gift money," she said, like she was saying, "We're out of milk." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard her right, and she repeated it with a smile, an actual smile, like she was doing me a favor. "Your brother still lives with us," she said, as if that explained everything. "He's struggling. You don't need it. You're taken care of now." I remember staring at her, feeling my brain slow down like a scratched CD. This wasn't a request. She wasn't asking. She was telling me. Like she had every right to. Like my wedding was just another family errand she was managing, and the money from the people who came to support us was just a line item in Derek's latest bailout plan. I opened my mouth to say something, I don't even know what, but before I could speak, Mark walked out. He must have seen my face from across the room, because he came straight toward us, calm as ever, like he was just joining a conversation about appetizers. He slid his hand onto my back and smiled at my mother, and without skipping a beat, said, "Actually, we already donated it." The look on her face twisted so fast I almost felt guilty. Almost. She blinked, tilted her head, still smiling but tighter now, like her Botox had just lost the will to hold it together. "I'm sorry," she asked, her voice doing that high-pitched thing she did when she was furious, but trying to seem polite. Mark looked at her, still calm, still pleasant, and said, "All $600,000. We donated it to the Blue Hearth Foundation. They help domestic abuse survivors rebuild their lives." $600,000. That's what he said. Out loud. I swear I heard the DJ trip over a beat inside, or maybe I imagined it. The number was absurd. No wedding brings in that kind of money, not even if you're a Kardashian. And yet, there he was, saying it like it was gospel. I saw the confusion flash through her eyes. She wasn't sure whether to be angry or impressed, and then she settled on offended. "Excuse me," she asked again, this time less shocked and more accusatory. "You did what with the money?" Mark didn't flinch. "We decided it was better used by people who actually needed help moving on from toxic households," he said, still smiling. That one hit harder than any slap. I saw her flinch then, barely, but enough. My dad had stepped onto the terrace now, watching like he'd walked into the middle of a movie he didn't want to be part of. And just beyond him, Derek stood near the bar, drink in hand, staring at us with his mouth slightly open like he was waiting for someone to explain the joke. I looked around at the people who'd built the cage I'd spent my life trying to decorate, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel afraid of them. I felt done. Completely, utterly done. Mom straightened her spine like she was preparing for a courtroom cross-examination. "That money was given to you," she hissed, her mask slipping, "not to some strangers." Mark shrugged. "Strangers treat her better than her own family does. Seems like a fair trade to me." And then it was quiet. The kind of quiet that presses on your ears and makes everything feel louder than it should. I could feel it coming, the blowback, the yelling, the guilt trips, the drama, but I wasn't bracing for it anymore. I was ready. Because when Mark said we donated it, I saw the truth behind his words. He didn't just mean the wedding money. He meant my freedom. The silence after Mark's words wasn't just uncomfortable, it was suffocating, thick with the weight of too many years of suppressed truths and unspoken resentments that had finally broken the surface like a corpse rising in murky water. My mother blinked at him slowly, her lips twitching like she was trying to piece together a reaction that wouldn't make her look bad in front of the few guests milling near the terrace doors, catching just enough of the exchange to sense that something was wrong but not quite grasping the full magnitude of it yet. She tilted her head in that familiar, condescending way she used when I brought home B-plus grades or wore the wrong color lipstick in high school, the way she looked at anything she thought was beneath her, pity masked as superiority. "What did you do, Mark?" she said, her voice dipped in sugar but edged with knives, like she thought she could talk her way through this the same way she'd always talked her way around every awful thing she ever said or did. "What exactly are you trying to prove here?" Mark didn't flinch, didn't even look away. His voice was quiet but carried more weight than anything she could have screamed. "You wanted to see what we did with the money," he said, calmly reaching into the inner pocket of his suit jacket like this was something he'd prepared for days ago. "So here, it's all in here." He pulled out a thick, white envelope, sealed and crisp, and handed it to her like he was passing a document in a courtroom. She hesitated for a moment, then snatched it from his hand with a look that suggested she fully expected it to be a joke or an empty gesture or some petty, immature statement that she could easily dismiss. But the moment she tore the flap and peeked inside, her face changed. Not dramatically, my mother never allowed herself visible reactions unless they served her, but enough that I saw the confusion hit first, then the cold realization, and finally the slow, creeping burn of humiliation. Inside the envelope was a printed donation receipt from the Blue Hearth Foundation, complete with tax documentation and an official thank you letter addressed to me, not Mark, not the both of us, but me, Sarah, thanking me personally for the contribution and detailing how the money would be used to provide transitional housing for women escaping violent households. Right behind it was a handwritten note on heavy cream stationery, written in Mark's precise, tidy lettering. This money came from people who love us. We used it to help people who never had that. And just beneath that was the kicker, an actual check, the kind you don't see much anymore, perfectly voided with two thick lines crossing it diagonally, Mark's signature in the corner, and written in red ink across the center were the words, "Not yours." I thought she might drop it. Her hand twitched like she might rip it up, but something about that red ink must have stunned her, like she was finally seeing, in writing, the boundaries she was never used to having. She looked up at Mark like she didn't recognize him anymore. "You planned this," she whispered, her voice brittle, her fingers shaking just slightly. "You manipulated her." Mark didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "No," he said plainly, "I protected her. Something you were supposed to do a long time ago." My chest felt like it was splitting open. Half of me wanted to scream, to cry, to run back into the reception and pretend none of this had happened. But the other half, the louder, clearer part, felt like I could finally breathe for the first time in decades. I looked at the envelope in her hands and felt a strange mix of triumph and grief. I wasn't just winning, I was winning against my own mother, and that's not the kind of victory that comes without its scars. That's when Derek decided to open his damn mouth. He came storming across the terrace like a pissed-off child whose toy got taken away, his drink still in his hand, sloshing slightly over the rim. "What the hell is this?" he snapped, eyes wild, cheeks flushed. "You think you're better than us?" Mark turned to him slowly, the same unreadable calm on his face, the same steady energy that used to drive my brother nuts whenever we all sat at the same table, and Mark didn't immediately crumble under Derek's lazy sarcasm. "I don't think," Mark said with the faintest smile I know. Derek's eyes went wide like he'd been slapped. "You smug son of a bitch," he spat, stepping forward like he actually meant to do something about it, but I stepped between them before it could go further. My body moved before my brain did, like some ancient reflex had finally decided to wake the hell up. I stood there, not flinching, not backing down, and looked Derek straight in the eyes. "You had 38 years to get your shit together," I said, the words pouring out like I'd been holding them in a vault, "and you never did because they kept cushioning every fall like it was our job to save you. But it's not. Not anymore. You're not my problem. You never were." He stared at me like he couldn't believe what he was hearing, but I didn't stop. "You want help? Earn it. You want support? Show up for yourself first. Because the pity party is over, Derek. No one's clapping for you anymore." My mother's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "You're heartless," she said, looking at me like I'd just shot the family dog. "How can you do this to your brother?" I turned to her slowly, every part of me vibrating with something sharp and electric. "I didn't do this to him," I said. "I just stopped doing everything for him." Her mouth opened like she had something to say, but for the first time in my entire life, she didn't speak. Maybe she knew nothing she said would land. Maybe she realized she'd lost the script. Maybe, just maybe, she was finally starting to understand that I wasn't the daughter she could mold anymore. Behind us, I could hear the music swell again, the reception marching on without us, people laughing and drinking and living their lives while this little disaster unraveled in the shadows. It was almost poetic, how the celebration didn't stop, how the world didn't end just because my mother finally got told no, and for once, I wasn't the one cleaning up the mess. I walked back inside with Mark, my hand in his, my spine straighter than it had ever been, and I didn't look back. Not at my mother. Not at my father. And certainly not at Derek. Because the envelope was sealed, the line was drawn, and there was no going back. When we got home that night, I didn't say anything for a long time. I kicked off my shoes, sat on the edge of the couch with my wedding dress still bunched awkwardly around my knees, and stared at the coffee table like it might offer some kind of answer that I hadn't already exhausted. The air in our apartment was too quiet, too still, the kind of silence that comes after something has cracked open and can't be sealed again, and all that's left is the waiting for it to sink in, for the damage to make itself known in full. Mark was already out of his jacket, sleeves rolled up, standing by the kitchen like he was trying to give me space, but didn't want to be too far in case I crumbled completely. I didn't cry at first, which surprised me. I thought I'd fall apart the second we walked in, the second the adrenaline wore off and reality settled in with its heavy coat of doubt and shame and guilt. But I just sat there, numb, my fingers locked together so tightly my knuckles ached. And then I asked him the one question I'd been holding on to since the envelope hit my mother's hand. Did we go too far? My voice was small, barely above a whisper, but I knew he heard me. He walked over slowly, sat beside me without touching me, just close enough to let me know he was there if I needed him. He stared straight ahead for a moment, then nodded. Maybe, he said honestly, not trying to cushion it. But it was the only way they'd finally hear you. And I think you needed to be heard more than they deserved to be comfortable. That's the thing about Mark, he never told me what I wanted to hear just to make me feel better. He told the truth, even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. And sitting there, still in my wedding dress, still tasting the bitterness of that final confrontation on the terrace, I realized something I hadn't been able to admit to myself before. I wasn't mourning the loss of a family. I was mourning the illusion that they were ever really mine to begin with. For years, I'd been told to let Derek have it. Let him have the last slice of cake. Let him have the bigger bedroom. Let him have the car on weekends. Let him have the sympathy, the second chances, the blind forgiveness. Don't make waves, they'd say, whenever I spoke up. Don't stir things up. Like being quiet and agreeable was my only role in this life they built around him. And I played it well. God, did I play it? Smiled through it, bent through it, shrank myself until I was so small I almost disappeared. But it wasn't just about being overlooked, it was about being used. They didn't ignore me because they didn't love me. They did it because I was convenient. I was functional. I could handle things. I could carry it. And they were right, I could. I carried more than I should have. Paid bills they didn't know about. Bailed Derek out of more than one mess he never thanked me for. Bit my tongue so many times I'd practically swallowed it whole. And now, on what should have been the happiest day of my life, I was realizing the only people who ever truly celebrated me were the ones I'd chosen, not the ones I'd been born into. That's when my phone buzzed. One short vibration. A text. It was my mother. I stared at the screen, heart pounding in my throat, already knowing it wouldn't be anything good. I opened it with the kind of hope you only have when you haven't quite let go yet, when some part of you still believes there might be an apology, a glimmer of understanding. But no, it said, in all its venomous simplicity, you broke the family. Not, let's talk. Not, we're hurt, but we love you. Not, I'm sorry we ruined your day. Just that. You broke the family. I read it 3 times before the words settled in. Not a single mention of what they had done. Not a single ounce of accountability. Just a pointed finger, as always, aimed at me. Like I was the wrecking ball when I'd spent decades being the scaffolding that held their broken structure together. I showed Mark the message. He looked at it for a long time, jaw clenched just enough to tell me he was restraining a stronger reaction. Then he looked at me and asked the simplest question, the one that made everything clear. Do you want to answer? And for once, I didn't hesitate. I typed slowly, deliberately, each word measured like a verdict. The family was already broken. You just didn't notice until I stopped bleeding for it. Then I hit send. And then, without giving myself room to second-guess it, I blocked the number. I expected to feel empty afterward. I thought I'd regret it, even if just a little. But I didn't. What I felt was clarity. Cold, sharp, but honest. Like pulling a thorn out after it's been festering too long, you finally feel the sting, and then you finally start to heal. We didn't talk much after that. Mark made us tea, and we sat in quiet for a while, wrapped in a cocoon of understanding that didn't need words to feel real. The wedding had become more than a celebration of love. It had become a battlefield, a final stand for who I was willing to be and what I was no longer willing to accept. I got up eventually, peeled off the wedding dress, hung it gently in the closet like it deserved better memories than the ones we'd just lived. I stood in the mirror for a moment, looking at myself, stripped down to the skin, tired eyes, hair tangled from dancing and drama, and I still saw a bride, but not in the way I'd imagined. I saw a woman who'd finally chosen herself. It was close to midnight when the knock came. 3 short raps at the door. Not frantic, not loud. Just enough to be deliberate. Mark looked at me from the kitchen. I walked to the door, heartbeat picking up again. When I opened it, I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But standing there, under the hallway light, was my father. And he was alone. He didn't knock like a man with rage in his chest, or grief bubbling behind his teeth, or even some dramatic apology rehearsed in the car on the way over. He knocked like someone arriving for an appointment they never wanted to make. 3 steady taps, neither tentative nor aggressive, just enough to be noticed, but not loud enough to demand anything. When I opened the door and saw my father standing there alone, dressed in the same dull gray sport coat he always wore to events where he felt uncomfortable, something inside me froze. Not in fear, not even in anger anymore, just in that heavy, immovable weight of knowing nothing he was about to say could undo anything that had already been done. He looked older than I remembered, even though I'd just seen him a few hours ago. Maybe it was the lighting. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was that guilt hangs heavier on some men than years ever could. He didn't ask to come in. He just looked at me, eyes low, hands stuffed into the pockets of a jacket that didn't quite fit right around the shoulders anymore, and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, I didn't know what they were planning. But I knew it was possible. And I should have stopped it. I didn't say anything at first. Not because I didn't have words, but because there were too many, stacked in my throat like sandbags, blocking anything from getting out. So I stepped aside and let him in, not out of kindness or obligation, but because I needed to hear it, whatever it was. I needed to let him carry this moment himself, without me cushioning the blow, without me translating for the benefit of his comfort like I had for 30 years. He sat down on the edge of the couch like it might reject him, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. The kind of posture that looks like praying but feels more like bracing. He didn't look around our apartment, didn't ask about the wedding or the reception or the guests or even how I was holding up. He just stared at his hands for a long minute, then finally looked up and said, I've watched a lot of things happen in our family that I didn't agree with. But I kept quiet. Because it was easier. Because I thought it would blow over. Because your mother was louder than me. The way he said it was like he was explaining away a missed bill or a traffic ticket, not years of silence that had cost me every shred of self-worth I had to claw back. I sat down across from him and asked the one question that had haunted me since I was old enough to notice who got protected in our house and who got overlooked. Why didn't you ever defend me? The quiet that followed wasn't awkward, it was heavy, full of all the chances he'd had and didn't take. All the times he could have stepped in when Mom called me selfish for not letting Derek borrow my car, or when she told me to stop asking for things because your brother's going through a hard time, or when I sat at the dinner table and listened to them talk about his potential like I wasn't even in the room. He didn't answer right away. And when he did, it wasn't a sentence. It was a breath. A deep, shaky inhale, followed by a truth I think he didn't want to carry anymore. I didn't know how, he said. And by the time I realized I needed to, I thought it was too late. I wanted to scream at him, wanted to throw something, wanted to shake him and say you were the adult. You were supposed to know how. But I didn't. Because that would have let him off the hook. That would have made it about my anger, not his cowardice. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out something small, a photograph, old and slightly bent at the corners. He handed it to me with the kind of care people use when offering something sacred. I took it without a word and looked down. It was me, maybe 8 or 9 years old, holding a certificate in front of a science fair project I barely remembered. I'd won first place for something involving magnets and electricity. Nothing special, just a school event. But in the background, behind me, just barely visible through the edge of the frame, was my mother. Her arms wrapped tightly around Derek, who was smiling. Not looking at me. Not clapping for me. Not even standing near me. I was in the foreground, alone. "I found it today," my father said quietly. "It was buried in a drawer in the office. I just wanted you to know I saw what they did. I was there. I was watching. And I didn't say anything. I should've." The part that broke me wasn't the photo. It wasn't even the fact that she hugged Derek and not me. It was the realization that this was the only moment my father had held onto as proof of my being erased. And it had taken him over 20 years to acknowledge it. He stood up then, like his time had run out, like the weight of this confession couldn't live in him any longer. I didn't stop him. I didn't ask for more. There was nothing else he could say that would make me believe he was a different man than the one who'd let me drown quietly while clapping for someone else's performance. At the door, he paused. I thought maybe he'd say something dramatic. Maybe he'd beg for forgiveness. Maybe he'd try to promise something, anything. But all he said was, "I hope you're happy." Really? That's all. And then he left. No resolution. No forgiveness. Just truth. Later, when I sat back down next to Mark, still holding the photo like it was some kind of relic, we didn't say much at first. He watched me, waiting, letting me process it without pushing. Finally, he asked what had been hanging between us all night. We did the right thing, didn't we? I looked at him, and I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just said the only answer that felt real. I think we did what we had to. Sometimes that's not the same thing. And that was it. I didn't lose my family that night. I just finally saw them clearly.